Hello everyone, apologies there for some technical difficulties. We are fashionably late as always, but never mind, we will continue. Thank you so much for joining us at this lovely online event celebrating the launch of this beautiful new book by Stephen Moss, Skylarks with Rosie, published today by independent publisher Saraband. My name's Lucy McRobert and I am a wildlife storyteller, a self-styled job that doesn't really mean anything, but at the same time means everything. Because like Stephen, I believe in making nature accessible to all and bringing wildlife to life through the power of storytelling, through books, through television, through radio, and all of those different mediums that Stephen so beautifully embodies. The publisher Saraband recommends supporting local bookshops, and the link to buy signed copies of Stephen books is in the event's notes through our partner Mr. B's Emporium in Bath, who brilliantly have been named the best bookshop in the Southwest by the Bookseller magazine. I think that was just today, so very exciting news for them and congratulations. The book's available to buy from all bookshops and sites as of today, so please do get your hands on a copy. But if you do want one of those signed copies, please do check in the event's notes. We're here today to celebrate Stephen Moss, my mentor, first of all, 10 years ago when we first met, and then my friend, and also now my colleague. And I love sharing all of these memories and stories with Stephen. He is such a great guy, as any of you will know who've met him, if you've met him at Bird Fair, at different events. I think he's toured the country about 30 times, selling 30 other books at least. So many of you here will have had the pleasure of meeting him, of getting to know him, and will hear his voice as you read through his book. That is what we're here tonight for. He's one of Britain's leading nature writers, broadcasters, and wildlife television producers. He now lives on the Somerset Levels, so beautifully brought to life through this, but was actually born in London. He read English at Cambridge before joining the BBC, and his TV credits, excuse me, I do have to read these from a list because they're quite substantial, include the BAFTA award-winning Spring Watch, The Nature of Britain, and Birds Britannia. See, he doesn't mention here, for anyone who grew up in the 1990s, things like Big Cat Diary, which was like the thing I grew up on. And his books include things like Wild Hares and Hummingbirds, Wild Kingdom, and The Robin, a Biography, which was basically proof that if you write a book about the robin at Christmas, it will actually go viral. A brilliant book, but also brilliantly timed in a way that only Stephen can. He authored the National Trust 2012 report, Natural Childhood, which really was the forefront of championing the idea of children reconnecting with nature, and has sparked a 10-year movement since in bringing our children and all children closer to the natural world. He writes a regular monthly birdwatch column for The Guardian, is president of the Somerset Wildlife Trust, and teaches an MA in travel and nature writing at Bath Spa University. You know, a number of people have been through that and are really, their careers are just taking off now. So if you do want to get involved in nature writing, it's really worth checking out that master's program. A number of people are really using his expertise and the skills and support available at Bath Spa to springboard their own careers. So it really is worth checking out that master's. A lifelong naturalist, Stephen has travelled to all 7 of the world's continents in search of wildlife. But I think the real joy of this book is that we don't go around the world, we celebrate what's right on Stephen's doorstep, and hopefully it will evoke some of the memories that you have as well of nature last year during lockdown on your own doorsteps. Before we pass over to Stephen, I really hope you'll allow me to share one funny story about Stephen. My husband and I got married in 2016, and Stephen was appointed the best man at our wedding. He was left in charge of organising the stag do. So whilst me and my wonderful girls disappeared off to the Isles of Scilly for 3 days of terrible drinking, playing on boats, watching birds, and generally having a terrible good time with various plastic phallic objects, Stephen decided instead that he was going to do something very highbrow and take my husband Rob and all of their birdie mates, people like Nick Baker, Mike Dilger, etc., off to Slimbridge to go on a tour of Sir Peter Scott's house. How terribly civilized of them. They stayed at the Cotswold Water Park in this kind of chalet, from what I can gather. I didn't ask too many questions. And a few days before the stag do, the lady who owned the chalet phoned up in a terrible panic that this was an all-male group, and could this possibly be a stag do, because she did not allow stag do's to stay in her chalets because of all the terrible things that stag do's do. Stephen, in a way that only Stephen can, without so much as missing a beat, explained to her that this was not a stag do at all. This was, in fact, a group of middle-aged to elderly gentlemen on a pilgrimage to visit Sir Peter Scott's house, some kind of semi-religious experience that they were going on, that there would be no drinking, that there would be no scantily clad women, that there would be no frivolity of any kind, in fact, but in fact just a kind of quasi-religious experience visiting a great ornithologist's house. Amazingly, this woman fell for it, although I do worry that the stag do genuinely was that boring. She fell for it, but I know which do I would personally have been on, and I will let you make up your own mind as well. With that, I'll just mention that we'll be talking for half an hour or so, chatting through, hopefully showing you some videos, and then we'll be taking your questions as well. So please do pop those questions in the chat box, and they will be relayed through to me by our amazing tech people over at Saraband. Before I forget, I don't want to leave this to the end in case anyone has to go. Can we just say a massive thank you to Sarah from Saraband, who's organised this whole thing and is doing an amazing job behind the scenes. You can't see her, but she's there. She's fabulous, and she's working really hard to make this happen. So thank you very much, Sarah, and all of the Saraband team. So, Stephen, we want to hear from you. First of all, tell us about your latest book. What is it about?
Well, before I do that, Lucy, I've got to say that genuinely there were no scantily clad women. There wasn't that much booze, and we did go on that pilgrimage. And she never actually said, "Are you a stag do?" She said, "We don't have stag do." So I'd never actually lied, Your Honour. Anyway, what the book is about, I suppose, it's the 3 months of spring. It's that extraordinary spring last year. It's the 13 weeks between the spring equinox, which of course is a year ago this weekend, to the summer solstice. And looking back, it was the most extraordinary time for everyone in different ways. Very sad time for many people, very difficult time, but also a time where I think we rediscovered nature. Some of us, many people I know who are not particularly into nature would call me and say, "Do the birds always sing this loudly at this time of year?" And so I think it was a time where there was this very small but significant silver lining, which was our love of the natural world.
Fabulous. I mean, this book really is about your local area, and hopefully we've got some footage of an area that you call the Loop. Do you want to tell us quickly about the Loop? Yeah,
well, basically, as you know, we of course were confined to barracks, weren't we? We had to stay where we were. I live on the edge of the Somerset Levels, and the Loop, you're going to now see a video taken by my eldest son, who was with us at the time, who's a filmmaker, and it's a drone shot. And there you see Rosie, George, and Charlie, and you see our garden, and you can hear Rosie going out now of the door. And then basically we have a very long, narrow garden, and then behind it, you've got these fields, which are relatively ordinary farm fields, sheep, silage, that sort of thing. And it was not really an area I'd particularly spent much time in, apart from cycling round. And then when we got Rosie the dog, walking her around there. And then at the start of lockdown, I realized that this little area you can see now, which stretches for 1 mile from my home, it's a 3-mile circuit. I realized that this was going to be my nature watching for who knows how long, but basically for the spring. And so that's where we spend our time.
Fabulous. And Stephen, I believe now you have your first reading. What are you going to share with us from Skylarks with Rosie?
I'm actually going to read you the prologue, because I have to tell you, I didn't intend to write this book. I started keeping the diary. I started keeping notes in the diary, and then it sort of developed into it. So let me just turn that light on.
That is unusual for you not to intend to write a book.
Yeah, well, that's it.
I mean, you intend to write books a lot.
Yeah, I'd finished one book. I hadn't started the next. I thought I'm going to have 3 months off, and then
I'll write a book.
Anyway, our world is cribbed, confined, and bound in as never before. Yet amidst all the fear and horror, there is one small but significant silver lining as we reconnect with nature on our doorstep. My Somerset garden is awash with birdsong, chiffchaffs, wrens, robins, and a new arrival, the blackcap, all competing to see who can shout the loudest as spring gathers pace. Overhead, buzzards soar and ravens tumble, as delighted as I am to herald the new season. But to hear a bird whose song is the definitive sound of the countryside, I must take my daily exercise, a walk with our fox-red Labrador Rosie around Blackford Moor, the little patch of land behind our home. I've seen some memorable birds here over the years, but as with any local patch, it's all about the commonplace. And here, and especially now, the ubiquitous bird is the skylark. A plump, triangular-winged shape rises up from the lane in front of us, then rapidly gains height, while continuing to deliver an outpouring of song, a rapid jumble of notes that seems to go on forever, even when the bird vanishes into the ether. As the dog and I stand and watch, I feel a new book coming on, Skylarks with Rosie. And then I really go on to talk about the fact that this extraordinary crisis that we were all going through, which for me made life feel like the sort of endless Sunday afternoons of my childhood, the boredom. And then spring came. And of course we knew it was going to come, didn't we? And yet I think it still surprised us. And it certainly surprised, as I say, lots of friends of mine who were suddenly, I think, having the opportunity to stop and notice birdsong and wildlife, really for the first time, in some cases ever, and in other cases, the first time, given that for the last few years, they've been very busy and on that treadmill of the rat race, if you like. So really, that's how it began.
That's lovely. So you always taught me in writing that there are two things to consider when you start writing a book. There's what is the book about, and then what is the book really about? So we've heard what the book is about, but what is the book really about?
Well, I got this from my lovely editor, Graham, dear friend of mine, who told me once that Henry James said, "You've told me the story, but what's the story of the story?" So the story of the book's very simple. I've just told you what it's about. It's a 3-month diary of spring. What it's really about is that realization that in this hyper-local world that we all live in for most of our lives, lockdown just intensified it, but most of us spend 99% of our time in and around our homes. And we spend, certainly as naturalists, we spend probably 99% of our time around our local gardens, towns, cities, villages, and perhaps our local patch. And yet, even though we couldn't go and see the wildlife, we couldn't travel even 3 or 4 miles down the road at the start of lockdown, the wildlife came to us. And it was that unfolding of spring, which has just begun now. The first chiffchaffs, the first wheat ear was seen the other day at the back of my home. And over the next few weeks, it'll be like freewheeling downhill on a bike as all the birds come back, and it'll be first the blackcap and then the swallow and the house martin and then the reed warbler and sedge warbler and then whitethroat and lesser whitethroat, and wheatears will be going through, and you know, perhaps whimbrels. We get whimbrels here very occasionally going through to Scandinavia or Scotland. So what the book, I suppose, is really about is that connection between the local and the global at a time of unprecedented change, a time where, apart from wartime, we've never lived through a period as extraordinary.
Mm-hmm. So this book is probably more personal, and I hesitate to say slightly more political than any of your other books, starting with your deeply controversial views on song thrushes and blackbirds. So I'm just going to read this bit from the book, which did have me chuckling an awful lot when I got sent this a couple of weeks ago. The evening is always a good time to compare the songs of the song thrush and the blackbird, as they continue to sing when other birds have already settled down for the night. I am one of the small minority of people who prefer the repetitive, insistent phrases of the song thrush to the more mellow, yet to me rather dull, sound of the blackbird. I just don't get why so many people, including, it must be said, my wife and most fellow nature writers, find the blackbird so compelling and evocative. Before the lockdown started, I was giving a talk at my local independent bookshop where I decided to provoke my audience by telling this. I was actually hissed at, albeit in a good-humoured way, for stating my preference. This is quite a controversial view, Stephen. Now, we've been running...
No, not remotely controversial, is it? I mean, let me tell you something. In January, the song thrush starts singing, and I hear it, and it talks to me. It says, get up, out of bed, even when it's dark. And it sings right the way through to June. The blackbirds in Somerset, when do they start singing? Shall I tell you? Yesterday morning at 4 o'clock, I woke up and I heard this me, 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 me. And I thought, what? I was half asleep. What earth is that? Oh, it's a blooming blackbird. I mean, of all the songs, Robin's got a beautiful song, Willow Warbler, Blackcap. The blackbird, I just don't get it. It's so dull. I mean, they're nice birds. I don't dislike them. I wouldn't have them, culled or anything. Because I put this on Twitter, didn't I, last year? I thought I was going to, I was being flamed by people.
Well, we have actually run this as a poll off the Saraband account, and you'll be pleased to know that 9 hours into the poll, song thrushes are currently actually winning the preference at 62.5% of the vote. Now, if you are terribly offended by everything that Stephen has just said, you can go to the Saraband Twitter account and vote for the blackbird if you want, but also have a think throughout about what your other favourite bird songs are. I mean, I don't think we have to necessarily settle for either song thrushes or blackbirds in the grand scheme of things. But I love the vitriol that always gets you going with. Yeah. I've heard that rant a couple of times, so I'm quite glad to see it officially in print now.
I thought Mark Cocker wasn't going to speak to me again. But as I say, I think I'm in a minority, but clearly not. Clearly, the Saraband Twitter followers and the people here clearly have fantastically good taste. Shall I tell you why I love the song thrush? It's because it talks to me. And shall I tell you a story that 100 years ago, my great-grandfather, Edgar Snow, walked back, before the First World War, he would walk back from his market garden to the pub where he was the landlord in Devon, and he would hear a bird saying to him, and it was saying, Snowy, Snowy, pay the rent, pay the rent. And my nan told me that, and after my nan died, I realised it was a song thrush. So that bird has that connection right back in our lives. And for me, that's what makes it really special, the fact it talks to you, and no other bird does that. Other birds have more beautiful songs, absolutely. Almost all songbirds have more beautiful songs than the song thrush, but it's just very special, I think.
You maybe should have written that in your book.
Yeah.
Rather than the rant that you did, but we'll leave that behind.
Book.
That can be your next book.
It's because it's in another book, so I couldn't put it in twice.
we get lost, we get confused. Anyway, so this book does definitely feel more personal, and we get a really nice insight into your family life here. We hear about your children, we hear more about the lovely Suzanne, your wife, and of course we hear about the dog. I think we're all secretly hoping that the dog's going to come bounding into camera, because she really is a beauty, and I think we're all a bit disappointed the dog's not on your lap, to be honest.
Yeah,
so fingers crossed that will happen. But was it intentional, do you think, to include so much more of your family in this?
I think it was inevitable rather than intentional. I promise you that when I edited this book in September, when I look back on it, I didn't change anything materially. I changed the prose a little bit. I tidied it up, and Craig, my editor, did a lovely job, just making it read better. But I didn't change, and he and I didn't change a single thing. So there's no hindsight in it. So when I write about the family, it's because that's what's happening. Now, we were very lucky. I have 3 teenage children. I have an elder son in Japan who couldn't obviously be with us, but another son who was meant to be in Japan, and he and his partner, Kate, had to come back and live with us. And then a friend came to live with us, Mark, who had coronavirus and was recuperating. So it was a pretty full household. And so I couldn't not write about them. They were part of my life, and that just felt right. It felt important at the time.
I think there's some really self-aware moments in there that I enjoy, like Suzanne having better eyesight, and those times where you doubt your partner and you go, don't be ridiculous, and then suddenly you realize they were right all along and you have to eat your words. And I love the way you talk about the kids, especially Daisy, because I mean, I've watched Daisy grow up and has always been like this little mini me following me around at Bird Fair. She's like one of my favorite people in the world because she's just so fiery and awesome and dry and marvelous. And I always think I'm sitting with a 25-year-old and I forget that she, like, how old is she? Like 15?
16 now.
16 now. And but it genuinely is like sitting with a 25-year-old. They're just marvelous kids all around, so I think it's really great to feel that coming through, and it was something that really brought the whole book to life for me. Do you want to lead in with your second reading now?
Yeah, sure.
Which is the personal one, I think, that was really the one that stuck with me when I read the book.
Yeah, this was week 5. Week 5 in the Big Brother house. On 26th of April, I turned 60. This was neither as traumatic nor as dull as I might have feared. I've long believed that age is a state of mind, and I'm constantly surprised. I had to tell myself this, didn't I? And constantly surprised how young most of my contemporaries look. Besides, our generation always has the consolation that we're considerably younger than the cohort of musicians we admired as teenagers, and who still behave as if they're just about 18. This was brought home to me watching Mick Jagger cavorting in his front room on the recent BBC lockdown gig. But I also remember how old my nan seemed when I first knew her, as a grey-haired old lady in her early 60s. Things were, however, very different then. My birthday got off to a great start. I was enjoying an alfresco breakfast with David, Kate and Suzanne when a cuckoo called from somewhere at the bottom of our garden. While I regularly encounter cuckoos on the Avalon marshes, this was only the second time I'd ever heard one from the garden. It felt like a good omen. The cuckoo's call is so close to the human voice and so easy to imitate that they always sound like a parody of themselves, but they never fail to bring joy to the hearer. Later that day, I read Rob Penn's lovely article in The Observer, in which he wrote eloquently about hearing the cuckoo. On this special day, I'd woken early, as I often do nowadays, and decided to announce my birthday on Twitter. I mentioned my mother, who'd been a single parent, or unmarried mother, as they were called in those benighted days. I felt a sense of immense pride tinged with a wave of sadness, as I tried to imagine the joy and fear my mother and grandmother must have felt when I was born 60 years before. Posting this, I was overwhelmed by the kind comments on Twitter, many from people I don't even know, and was glad I'd told their story on this special day. And I know, Lucy, I know how you write so beautifully about your late mother, and it is, you know, again, that connection with nature that we have through our families, isn't it? And those memories are very important. And I think in lockdown, those memories, perhaps because we weren't as busy, we weren't as frantic just for that short period. And I think, you know, of course, on birthdays and anniversaries, you think back, but my mother was the person who got me in. Well, she didn't get me interested in bird watching, I did, but she then ferried me about and took me places and took me out of school to take me to the Isles of Scilly for 2 weeks instead of doing my O-levels and things, you know. So I wanted again to mention that. But I didn't plan to do any of this. The book wasn't planned at all. It was just, I just wrote it. And it's, you know, I think it's probably the most honest book I've written for that reason.
Oh, that's beautiful. So, following on from that, because I feel that's quite a deep question, that's a very personal reading that you've done for us, I thought we'd have some fun now, and this is possibly a little bit mean of me.
Of course.
But I've read the book, and I thought there were some marvellous facts in it, things that I didn't know or things that happened to you. So I've pulled out 5 questions, 5 quick fire questions that I'm going to throw at you. For the purpose of the audience, Stephen has no idea what these are. I hope I've got them all correct, because that'll be embarrassing if I've got the answers wrong and he knows more than I do from his own book. So Stephen, question 1, just shout out the answer. If you don't know, just say you don't know. Question 1, how does Dominic Cousins describe the call of the rook?
Oh, that's easy. Wonderful, wonderful description. He says, a rook sounds like a crow who's been on an anger management course, which is just brilliant. And I always acknowledge Dominic when I plagiarize him, but, you know, it's it's a cracker, isn't it? Absolutely lovely.
Fabulous. Well done. That
are you going
to
ask me Graham's description of a yellow wagtail? I'll do that afterwards. Go on.
You can do that afterwards. That could be a bonus point. By Easter Saturday in lockdown, you had seen 8 species of butterfly, but one was notable by its absence. Which one?
Small tortoiseshell.
Correct. Any ideas why?
I don't. And what's odd, Matthew Oates would know, of course. What's odd is that later in the summer, by May, June, they were everywhere. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't like there was a shortage. It was that first, they overwinter as adults. I was getting peacocks, brimstones, loads of commas, we don't normally get. It was holly blues, speckled woods. I had a good year for butterflies, but mainly because I was in the garden all the time.
Have you seen a small tortoiseshell yet this year?
I've only seen one butterfly this year, peacock. I've seen it twice.
Oh, right. I had my first brimstone yesterday. Nearly crashed the car.
Exactly. Yes.
So, question 3. What was the first bird shared on Twitter on International Dawn Chorus Day by Australian birder Sean Dooley?
Sean Dooley, Twitchathon. Oh, I want to say Australian magpie.
3 for 3, Stephen. Doing well.
Oh, God. Yes. I mean, that was the other lovely thing about lockdown, of having these Twitter friends like Sean, who is a friend, and then friends who I've never met, like, various people in the States. And it was, and you were sharing that same moment of being local. So, yeah.
Oh, well done. You're doing very well. Question 4. What insect do your son David and his partner Kate find in week 10 of lockdown?
They find a lesser stag beetle and then they let it go. They don't bring it to show me. They take because David's part of that, millennial generation like you. He takes a photo of it and lets it go. And he
should have pinned it to a board. If he was you, he should have stuck a pin through it.
Yeah, I've never seen I've never seen a lesser stag beetle, and he thought it was a baby stag beetle, but I looked it up and then checked, and it was a lesser.
Oh, both gripping and marvelous at the same time.
Yeah.
So, question 5, you're doing very well. 4 for 4 so far. What word is used to describe rats, which are, and I quote, deeply suspicious of any changes in their immediate environment?
Neophobic.
Fabulous. Well done, Stephen. 5 for 5. It proves you do know what you're talking about and you don't just go on Wikipedia.
I did read my own book, yeah.
I got told to do that. Someone said to me, like, you have to read your own book. Someone's like, I was like, why? I wrote it. They're like, no, you won't remember it. Read it.
You have to read it, and you have to read it loud before you send it off. You read everything out loud, and then you notice the fact you use the same word over and over again. And the question you didn't ask was, what does my Glaswegian friend Graham Mitchell, how does he describe seeing a yellow wagtail? And I shall do it tactfully. He said, Stephen, I saw this yellow wagtail. He said it was like an effing canary, only he didn't say effing, but you get the picture, which I think is the perfect description of a yellow wagtail.
Yeah, I'd go with that. So we've already alluded to this, that it feels like in the past year we've seen a lot more of your political side, both in this book and on Twitter. Frankly, I've been shocked sometimes when I've gone on your Twitter and been like, whoa, Stephen's ranting about the government. What's driving this? Or should we just be putting it down to you're just getting a bit grumpier in your old age?
I wondered that. I think the problem is, and this is a tricky one, but I'm going to be serious about this. I don't think in all the history of incompetent and corrupt governments, and corrupt was not a word people would use about British governments in the past, incompetent, yes, misguided, all those things. But you would never, for example, describe Margaret Thatcher as corrupt. You would never in a million years imagine she would be. But we are now governed by a group of people who are both, this extraordinary combination of corruption and incompetence and dishonorable. And that's not a word I use lightly. And when, as you know in the book, when I can't even mention his name, but the spad comes out into the rose garden and sits there and defends him driving off to Durham. And I'm not going to dignify him with his name. I was so angry that my family, who were all gathered around the television to watch it, had to send me into another room to watch it on a different television, because I honestly thought he was going to resign, because that would have been the honourable thing to do. So I think seriously, we've talked about, the silver lining of the pandemic, but it's a tiny silver lining, this love of nature, at a time where 125,000 people now have died and countless people have been bereaved. And our friend who was convalescing with us very nearly died of this. And it was, I just think that we need to call them out. And I know a lot of people are. And I know the trouble with Twitter is it's a bit of an echo chamber. So you only get followed by people who agree with your opinions and vice versa. But I do think there's a real, as I said in the book, when that happened, there was a real upsurge of anger from people who have never been political on Twitter. And I think we do need to call them out. We need to call them out on the environment. We need to call them out on all these other things. So yes, it is a political book, and it might get, another book I'm writing now might get more political.
Well, I was going to read out the bit of the book, but you've pretty much just said it word perfect, and I feel it would be quite repetitive of me. If anyone does want some anger, that genuinely is Stephen. To lighten the mood, we're sharing now a time lapse of Stephen cycling the loop. It's a shame he doesn't quite actually go this fast.
I don't go this fast. This was actually David cycling around with his GoPro. And what you're seeing is it's four sides, it's like a queue. It's four sides of a square plus a little tail. And what you're seeing is that it as a habitat, it's not particularly prepossessing. It's wide hedgerows, grassy fields, some rough, some pretty much, improved grassland, and a few trees. And this is the bit coming back to our home, and a few reens, and a slightly. And I wrote a piece for Inkcap Journal this week about this, about the lockdown. And I'd calculated, this sounds really anal and nerdy, and it is, but I have seen within a mile of my home in the last 15 years, 99 species of bird, 24 species of mammal, 24 species of butterfly, which is more or less between a third and a half of all the species you're ever going to see in Britain of those groups. And that's within a mile of my home in a not terrible environmental area, but it's not that good. It's not a nature reserve. It's, and yet my point being, you can see and experience in this very constrained habitat almost half of all the common wildlife you see. I mean, Jennifer Owen in her garden in Leicester, 8,000 species in one garden, So it's here. And I think that's the other message of the book, is that you can enjoy where you live, wherever you live, certainly in towns and cities. British towns and cities are often extremely good for wildlife. And if you live in the right parts of the countryside, and Somerset is pretty good, you can also enjoy it. So I think that was, again, that's the message of the book, that you don't have to travel. And this, of course, ties in with the whole idea of trying to be, keep a low carbon footprint.
When we chatted the other day, one of the things I really loved talking to you about was that as naturalists, we start to name places as we go through the same routes over and over again. So you end up with like Stonechat Hedge and Wheatear Alley. Did you find you doing that for?
Yeah, Derek Neiman wrote a beautiful Guardian Country Diary about that. We do, yeah. We call a place at the end Steph's Corner, because someone we know called Steph once managed to drive into a reen there. And I don't necessarily name the trees, but I know them. And I also know, and this, anyone with a local patch will know this, that, I'm looking for wheatears at the moment, and I'm looking in two fields, because that's where the wheatears turn up in the spring. They don't stay here, they pass through in spring and autumn. So yes, I'm looking as I go round, but I'm expecting to see them in a certain field. And sometimes I'm surprised. Sometimes things, surprise me. But that localness, which John Clare and Gilbert White had, and I think a lot of modern naturalists have. Mark Cockerell, I mentioned earlier, at Claxton, his village in Norfolk where he lived, wrote beautifully again in his country diary about that. In fact, Guardian Country Diary, people like Amy Jane Beer, Nicola Chester, and many others are usually writing about where they live and why it's special to them. And that's the key thing about wildlife, isn't it? You know, if we wanted to see more species, we'd go to Costa Rica, which I'd love to do. But in the meantime, let's enjoy what we have on our doorstep. And it's special because it's on our doorstep.
With that in mind, you're very self-aware, I think, throughout this book, to really show your readers that you know how lucky you are to have this amazing piece of countryside on your doorstep. And at the start of lockdown last year, you and I were involved in running a competition, weren't we, for young naturalists, and not even naturalists, just generally any young person to write about nature on their doorstep. And we saw all these different people coming in and sending stories about the centre of London, all the way. My favourite ones were, there's one from the centre of London by a girl who'd actually had her home destroyed in the Grenfell Tower incident. And then we had another girl from Fair Isle who'd lost her home in the Fair Isle Bird Observatory fire. And the fact that these two people could not have had more different lives and upbringings, but were both united not only by this horrible tragedy that they'd both lived through, but also by this love of nature, and that they'd been brought together by this competition. And this is a more general question for you in terms of things that we've seen going on politically at the same time as lockdown. So the Black Lives Matter movement, which was triggered last year, now there's a big question about women and safety within the countryside and safety within rural areas. How do you think we make nature and the countryside and wild places in general equal and accessible for all people?
Absolutely. Well, you and I have always wanted to get more people out there. Now that can create problems. We know last year, when you've got hotspots and people rushing out and lighting barbecues and things, but yet people go out with good intentions. And I think one of the problems is this bizarre thing in Britain, actually, that people think the countryside is full of wildlife and cities aren't. In fact, it is broadly the opposite. Most of the countryside has very little wildlife unless you're on a nature reserve. Most cities have all sorts of little nooks and crannies for wildlife. So I think we do need to focus on the 80%, 85% of people who live in towns and cities, and particularly children, and try to encourage them, walking to school, those sort of things, where they notice nature. I was shocked last week. I wasn't surprised, but I think, like a lot of men, I hadn't really thought this through. You wrote a wonderful piece for Bird Guides, very measured, thoughtful, and really, really well-researched piece, where you got women to talk about their own experiences in nature where they have felt fearful, or occasionally worse than felt fearful. They have had very good reason to be fearful, or have been attacked or exposed to and whatever, And I read this and just thought, that is so depressing and yet so true. And I do think that what was lovely was the responses to it, a lot of which, I would say the majority of which, the ones I saw, came from men supporting you absolutely unequivocally. And what James Beaumont, the young birder, wrote, which was great, he said, of course it's not all men, but it can be any man. And that is such an important point, And the idea, and I've occasionally, when I've gone out at night, to my local patch birding, felt very vaguely uncomfortable. More than if I fell over and broke my leg, if I've forgotten my phone, how would I get out, sort of thing. But the idea of a woman of any age being fearful of going out birding, and several wrote about that, and several had had incidents in the last week or two about this, just really, I find it horrific. And men cannot avoid the responsibility for this anymore. And that lovely phrase, men are always afraid women will laugh at them, women are afraid men will attack them, is a very good one. And of course, we do need to work on this. And the same with, and it has improved dramatically in the last few years, the same with making nature watching more diverse. But again, Sorrel Lyle, a year or so ago, wrote a very thoughtful and considered Twitter feed. Now, Twitter isn't the best place to do it, but she did. It was really good about how she sometimes felt uncomfortable as a young woman of mixed race going out in the countryside, and sometimes she felt she was the only person looking like she did. Sometimes she was the only young woman in groups birding, and she got abuse. And what was depressing, actually, wasn't the trolling, it wasn't the horrible abuse, because there's always going to be nutters out there. It was the sort of, oh, no, this is not a problem at all, love type approach. You know, that I find that actually more upsetting, because you know there's going to be a minority of, you know, as you do with right-wing politics, you know, there's a minority of extremists out there in any society. But what was depressing was I felt that the response to her Twitter feed was more like the majority of male birders of a certain age, and often much younger than I am, basically saying, not a problem, which is absurd. You know, clearly there is a problem. She wasn't saying it's horrific. She wasn't saying she gets overt racial abuse every time she goes out. That's not the point. The point is she feels it, and sometimes she feels uncomfortable. So I think that, you know, I think that Black Lives Matter, I think Extinction Rebellion, I think the whole movement now we're seeing with male violence stroke women's safety is good, because it's bringing it out. And I think we as naturalists, who by and large are a very close knit, friendly and kind community, need to now lead on this. We can't just expect everyone else to sort it out. And I think you did brilliantly leading that. If anyone hasn't read it, go onto the Bird Guides website, because it is such a really, you know, you said all the right things.
Well, I think it's really important that, I think allyship is everything in this, and that's certainly what I felt when Sorrel and other especially young black birders, but generally all black birders, were talking about this issue, and me thinking, well, I can't understand what you're talking about, because I've not experienced that. But at the very least I can do is I can listen, and I can empathize, and absolutely, I can try to put myself in your shoes. And we've just had a comment from Dick Philby, who is the founder of Rare Bird Alert, the wonderful bird news service, and he said, isn't it so true that you need to put yourself in others' shoes, and most of us cannot? And I think that is something that is so powerful whenever we read nature writing, whenever we connect with nature, whenever we have those moments. So many of us find solace and safety and comfort in nature, and ultimately that's what we want all people to
absolutely
have. And I love that I think that shines through in your writing so much. I think there's so much self-awareness. I think there's so much reflection, and especially in this book now more than ever, you do go into those political issues in a way that's very accessible. It's not scary, it's not finger pointing, it's not judgmental. It's just kind of your views expressed in these beautiful, well-mannered, generally polite ways. And I think it's really marvelous that nature writing is kind of going down this route away from just, oh, look, isn't a butterfly pretty?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other thing about it, Lucy, is that I say in the book, that the younger generation, of which I include you, but of course we've now got younger ones coming through, you know, in their teens. And what I've always loved about those people, and, you know, you founded a Focus on Nature and you involved me in that, and I got to meet a lot of them, and I got to mentor some, and then just get to know some as friends, is that they could easily say, you know, you're, particularly my generation, you're out of touch, you know, you've messed up with global climate emergency, you know, and lump us all like that. And they've never done that. They've always been very inclusive towards us and to each other. And I think that your generation can teach us a great lesson, because let's face it, you know, when I was growing up, I have a really dear friend who I sat next to on my first day at school at the age of 11, who's a birder and Daisy's godfather, and we still see each other very regularly. I didn't have this sounds terrible, I didn't have another birding friend till I was 29 years old. And that's because birders, there weren't very many of us. They were all blokes. They were mostly older blokes who were quite unfriendly. David Lindo writes about this very humorously, and he's dead right. And by and large, it wasn't a nice community. You didn't feel, it was quite cliquey and quite exclusive. And that's not the case now. And I think social media has helped that enormously. A Focus on Nature and other organisations have helped that. So I'm fairly hopeful that we can get through this, and that we can absolutely call out any male wildlife watchers, birders, conservationists who do, you know, display, even however unthinkingly, the wrong attitude. because that's what it's about. It's about not, it's not censoring them. It's saying that's not acceptable. There are certain things that aren't acceptable.
Mhm.
And, all women birders know this, that they're walking along. A number of people who said, I walk along with my partner and we meet a birder we don't know. And that bird will always turn to my partner and say anything about, what have you seen? And he'll say, I'm not the birder, she's the birder. It's,
Well, Stephen, thank you very much. That's all of my questions, but I know we've got questions coming in from the audience. And thank you very much to everyone who's participated in the chat so far, who's shared their comments, their thoughts, their political views on both song thrushes and Dominic Cummings. And thank you very much for all being so interactive and marvellous. So first question from Glyn.
Don't take his question, Lucy.
It might be your Glyn, or it might be another Glyn. I
know perfectly well which Glyn
it could be a different Glyn. So Stephen, as a keen cyclist, can you share any of your favourite rides, and did you see any birds from the taxi? However, he has added a wink, so I suspect that's an in-joke.
Let me explain that Glyn is my oldest friend, and I say that carefully, in that we've known each other since we were at school when we were 5. And many years ago now, we did do a cycle ride through Wales, and 2 of us had to go back early and it was raining. So we took a taxi instead of cycling the 50 miles to the station. And he and others have never let us forget it. But what I did do this summer is another friend of ours, Simon, who Glyn knows, and a couple of others, cycled coast to coast. As I say in the book, we're going to do it. And we did do it across Hadrian's Wall. It nearly killed us, but we did it for 4 men around 60. So, and I have seen some very nice birds from my bike rides.
Were there any photos of this? I think we need evidence.
There are photos, but they're so embarrassing.
Yeah, that wasn't put on.
I wear Lycra, and Suzanne hates that. She won't release the photos. She destroys them.
Brilliant. Oh, please do send her in with the dog. We're still waiting. And so Stephen, you do actually have to share. Do you have any?
Right, dog's here. Rosie,
Yay!
Come here. Come here. Good girl. Come here.
Rosie.
No, she doesn't notice things like that. But anyway, that's Rosie. You've seen her.
Rosie is marvellous. To be honest, when Rosie was a puppy, she was, I'd like to swear at this point, but I'll just suffice with saying she was one of the naughtiest dogs I'd ever.
Oh, yes. No, she still has her moments, but she has settled down. She's 4 next week.
If anyone wants to laugh, we were once staying at Stephen's house when Rosie was a teenager, shall we say. And we got up and walked around downstairs and wondered where everyone was gone. It turned out everyone was literally, the entire household was involved in trying to herd the dog back into the garden for the 2nd time that day. She was like a Houdini. But then we came back 2 weeks later from our trip, and the dog was an angel. So I don't know what you did to her in that 2 weeks.
We beat her and locked her in a room for 48 hours.
This will be recorded, so we might want to edit that bit out. He is joking. That didn't happen. So Stephen, as a keen cyclist, Glyn genuinely has a question. What are your favourite bike rides?
Well, the main one is round the loop, bizarrely. I mean, that's only 3 miles. I now do a 6-mile run round the village, where about 2 months ago, I actually saw from my bike one of Tim Mackerel's and Roy Dennis's white-tailed eagles. So that is a pretty good thing. I never thought I would ever see a white-tailed eagle in my village. And it made the village website. Everyone got very excited about it, and it was lovely, So I do see some good birds from the bike, and I now take a small pair of binoculars that I put in my thing. So if I, because otherwise it's like going out without your trousers on, isn't it? You're a birder and you haven't got binoculars with you. So, yeah.
I mean, you can't miss a white-tailed eagle, but yes.
No, well, so you say that, but it was perched in a tree and it wasn't that obvious, actually. Surprisingly.
People have said this in the Isle of Wight, that they do actually, everyone thought there'd be like this giant bird stuck in the middle of the island and everyone would be pointing at it, but actually they do blend very well into the landscape.
I mean, they're big, but they're not, they're not quite barn doors.
So next question is from the lovely Nigel Scott. You'll be delighted to hear. So Stephen, you've lived in Somerset for some years. How has wildlife changed in that time? Has it been for the better or the worse?
Well, that's a really good question, Nigel. Generally, it appears to have got a lot better. So, for example, when we moved here, there were little egrets, of course, but not that many. There were no bitterns. This was 15 years ago. No bitterns, one pair of marsh harriers, no bearded tits that we could ever find, no cattle egrets, no great white egrets. Today, I saw a little egret. Yesterday, I saw a great white egret around the loop. You know, I see, if I drive across the levels, I see flocks of cattle egrets, up to 100 of them. Cranes, of course. So it appears to be much better. The downside is when I moved down here, I genuinely thought that there'd be, I hadn't really done my research. I thought there'll be willow tits and grasshopper warblers and you know, lots of barn owls. I mean, barn owls are funny. We saw 2 the other night, Charlie and I, but, you know, generally a lot of birds here are scarce. And things like whinchats, which back in the 80s, there were 150, 140 pairs breeding on the levels. And now I'm lucky if I see 1 a year as a passage migrant. I think there was a flock of 700 whimbrels back in the 70s. Most I've ever seen is about 20, you know, along the coast. So I think we need to be very careful. Somerset is one place where people are coming to see really exciting birds like these egrets and the bitterns and the cranes and the starling murmuration. But we mustn't forget that a lot of the smaller birds, particularly farmland, of course, and woodland birds, are dropping off a cliff. You know, I was talking to someone today about tree sparrows. I used to see tree sparrows in Bushy Park in Teddington when I was a kid. And now they've finally gone, I think, from London, you know, completely.
Oh, that's so sad.
And you know, it's birds like that I tell you, the one at the moment I'm noticing, or not noticing, this year I've seen dozen sparrowhawks in my garden and around the loop. I've seen a couple of marsh harriers. I've seen buzzards every day. I haven't seen a kestrel. I've seen 2 on the coast this year. That's it. Probably the same.
Kestrels are the bird of prey that no one talks about, aren't they? We shine a spotlight on bird of prey persecution, which is obviously an absolutely enormous issue. But in terms of bird of prey declines, kestrels certainly were, I don't know if they still are, but were the fastest declining bird of prey in the UK, and they're the one that we all have a responsibility towards in that respect. They don't live and breed on some far-flung moorland where no one ever sees them. They're birds that we should be seeing 10 a penny on any trip down the A47 type thing.
And it's like with all these things, isn't it? When you only notice them when they've gone. I mean, sparrows, when I was a kid, you'd see clouds of house sparrows in the suburbs of London where I was brought up. Probably, I don't know, 1,000 in a flock was pretty typical. Like you see starlings now, actually, particularly this year. And of course, you never see that now. We've still got a few here, few sparrows nesting in the hedgerow near us and in our eaves. But, you know, it's when birds like that start to go. And I think it is a problem. And of course, we forget. If you're old, you forget. And if you're young, you don't know. You don't know that there used to be vast flocks of sparrows, because how could you?
Absolutely. So, sorry, we're getting quite a few questions through now, so I'm just scanning through.
I'm looking at them as well.
So, Stephen, did you feel different when you wrote the summer postscript and the winter solstice postscript?
Yes, the summer postscript, which was intended to be the end of the book, was written on a day when we all went for a walk. It was just before David and Kate left and Mark left us. So it marked a change, and we were coming out of the first lockdown at that point. At that point, we didn't think that there'd be a second and a third lockdown. But anyway, we went for the walk, and there wasn't much happening. And genuinely, I did not make this up. Genuinely, and someone's asked what's Rosie's favourite bird, obviously skylarks, because genuinely a skylark started to sing at that point, and it was more or less the only bird we heard. You know, by then, as you know, by mid-June, things have really dropped off. It was quite a windy day. And the winter solstice one, I just felt that it needed an ending, looking back with some retrospect at the very end. And I don't know, you know, there comes a point where you have to stop, I suppose, but winter solstice felt quite down last year for everyone, didn't it? And
Well, it did, but I was on the Isles of Scilly and we could
Oh,
go to
yes,
the pub and we had humpback whales.
Yes, yes.
But carry on. For everyone else, I will hold my hands up and say the winter solstice was appalling.
Yeah. But then it also had that hope that, as we've seen, you know, and it is gradual at the moment, it is like cycling, to use the analogy again, to the top of a long, shallow hill, and you know that very, very soon you're going to crest the top and go down, and the birds are going to come in. You know, I saw a pheasant today on the loop first this year. You know, I heard a little owl the other day, but suddenly in the next month, a dozen species that have been in Africa are going to be there, and that, you know, that has to give hope, doesn't it? You have to feel a sense of hope, and that's what nature gives us. And you know, it's a weird thing. I can't really explain it, but we all know, don't we, if we're into it. I read something interesting today. Kurt Vonnegut apparently said, this was quoted in an article not about Kurt Vonnegut, that Kurt Vonnegut, the writer, said, you're born with a family and then you spend your life searching for a different family. And what he meant was like-minded people. And I think we've seen from the response to women posting about feeling concerned going out and unsafe in nature, from the positive response we've seen of people saying, no, we're with you, we've got your, you know, we've got your back, we'll try to behave better and we'll try to persuade others to. I think what we've always known is that the community we're in of people who love nature are like a family, a very big family. And of course, Bird Fair, which you mentioned earlier, which Nigel, of course, is involved in. You know, I was very miserable this year when I heard it wasn't happening again. It was bad enough last year, but because that for me is the one time, and if any of you haven't been there, and many of you won't have done, try to go if it does start again in 2022, because that's where you get that sense of a community of people from all backgrounds, social backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, different countries, different colours, different ethnic backgrounds, different sexuality, different ages, all united by this common appreciation and love of nature. And that, you know, it's where I first got to know you, Lucy, and it's such an important, event. So fingers crossed for that.
Absolutely. So I'm gonna, we may have to go through the questions slightly quicker, because we keep getting distracted and chatting. So Rachel did say, what is Rosie's favourite bird, which you've already answered. So I'm going to ask the cheeky question that I don't know if anyone else has actually dared to ask. Did you call Rosie Rosie because 5 years ago you thought Skylarks with Rosie? No. Great title for a book, that.
No, I promise. I'm a huge fan of Laurie Lee. Having started teaching nature writing 5 or 6 years ago, just as I was got the job, I happened to go to a Cheltenham festival and they were giving away copies of Side with Rosie for no apparent reason. And I picked it up, and it's not a book I'd read since I was 16 when I studied at school. And I started reading it and thought, oh my goodness, the opening of Side with Rosie is one of the greatest pieces of nature writing ever written. And I love the fact you can find nature in lots of writers. Lee clearly is not a nature writer. So it is a homage to him in a way. So no, I called her Rosie, which was a mistake because I now call Daisy Rosie and Rosie Daisy quite a lot. Because I've always struggled to remember my children's names, and with a dog as well, it's just really complicated.
You only have one girl. She got the girl right.
Now.
So question from Dick, which I really enjoy here. What's your favourite way to engage and educate the passing grockle?
Yeah. Well, I suppose in my village, I noticed very early on that people sort of knew I was into birds. So people in the shop would shyly say to me, saw a kingfisher the other day down Kingsway, or barn owl, whatever. So I always try to talk to them. I put it out, I've written now 3 books about my village effectively, or, the area around here. And I try to push that because that great myth that country people all know about nature and city people are ignorant could not be further from the truth. But there's a lot of people where I live who would love to know more about nature, and feel, as people I've met over the years always do, they think that if they went to a nature reserve, they'd be wearing the wrong clothes or carrying the wrong equipment or whatever. And birders have not helped that. I've been down to the starlings a few years ago and someone said, well, these bloody people come see the starlings. Some of them haven't even got binoculars. And it was like, good. so they're not birders and they're coming to see them. That's a good thing. So, I think it's about sharing our passion. I once said I'm an evangelist for nature, and I got a lot of flack for that from someone. But that's what we do. It's what we all do. Dick does it, you do it, I do it. We try to convert people. We're proselytizers. We're like those mad American preachers. It's like a sort of natural, I'm going to get controversial, it's not like a natural jihad, is it? No, that's not quite right, but you know what I mean. It's like it's basically, we need to convert more people. Now, the good news is when I started birding, as I've said, no one was into birding. As Mark Cocker put it so beautifully, I used to hide my binoculars at the age of 12 under my anorak in case any girls saw me. And then he adds the killer line, I don't know why I was so worried. I didn't even know any girls. Nature was not cool when I was a kid. And somehow it has become so. And that's great, and I think that's what we do. We just, and so many people want to know more about it. I get this all the time from friends, neighbours, my kids' friends, parents. We take them out to the starlings. They love it, So it's about doing that. And we can all do that.
Brilliant. So, question from Sue Williams. Do you have a favourite area in Britain for birding or just in general? And as you've travelled so much, do you have a favourite foreign location as well? You're not allowed to say Somerset to this. I'm going to level with you.
Obviously, I'd have to say to Sue, in and around the Grant Arms Hotel in Speyside is lovely. If it's that, I think it probably is. So I love lots of places in Britain. I love the Hebrides, where Donald's from, Donald Murray, who's also asked a question and contributed 2 wonderful poems to my book. I love, Norfolk and Suffolk, of course, over the years, Kent, where I used to bird quite a lot. Abroad, Botswana, the Okavango Delta is pretty extraordinary. But usually it's the place I want to go next, which, if Dominic Cousins and I get our act together, will be Costa Rica sometime next year.
If anyone wants to go with them, I'm sure they will happily guide people around. They might even throw in a free lunch for you.
It's a question from Stephen. I'm looking at the questions now.
Stop distracting yourself. This is my job. We've got a system here, Stephen. Stop ruining it. So someone's asked me a question, which is marvelous, which is, have I ever been to America and do I plan to visit? I went to America when I was 5 years old to go to Florida because my dad won a trip, which was a bit random. Can't remember it in the slightest, other than the Aladdin parades through the center of Disney World. We went to Boston a few years ago because we've got friends who live on the Massachusetts coast, and we went whale watching, fin whales, humpback whales, minke whales. It was incredible. It was a brilliant but very short kind of trip to go and see friends more than anything. I think it would be definitely back on the cards. I know Rob's desperate to go to California, and we'd probably do Yellowstone at the same time. And we feel like we can now because very wisely you've changed your leadership. If you fancy giving us some tips on how to do that, it would be much appreciated. So Stephen, you're desperate to answer this question, I can tell, because you've alluded to it twice. A question from Donald Murray. As a Scottish Gaelic speaker, there seems to be no competition between the blackbird and the thrush. Lots of songs about the latter. So if you ever fancy writing a book about your enthusiasm, ...
Well, Donald very kindly not only provides his own 2 beautiful poems in the book, which I've quoted, and one of them is the epigram to the book, or epigraph, whatever they're called at the beginning. But Donald's also helped me with my next bird biography, which is on the swan, because there's the most incredibly moving song, Gaelic song, Scottish Gaelic song about swans from the First World War. Song thrush is quite high on the list of if I do another bird biography, but funnily enough, the bird I thought I might do if I do another one is the house sparrow, because I think that is the bird that in our lifetimes has declined more than any other in terms of numbers, not in terms of percentage, but in terms of numbers. We've lost something like 20 million sparrows since I was born. When you say lost, it's like, oh, we'll find them somewhere down the back of the sofa, but it's not quite like that, is it? So yeah, but if I do thrush, Donald, I'll be straight over to you for all the wonderful heritage. And of course, the Scots write about thrushes instead of blackbirds, because they're
Don't hold your breath though, Donald. He's not going to pay you a third of his advance. So, oh, I love this one from Rachel Henson.
Yes.
Are your new naturalists in order?
Yeah, Rachel's one of my former and very talented students on the Bath Spa course. Yes, they are. Of course they are, Rachel. You knew they were. All my things were in order.
I mean, actually, you say that, but one thing you also say in the book is that you reorder your books a number of times throughout lockdown. So they're in order now, but they weren't this time last year.
Yes.
So, question from Stephen Lovell. You have alluded to the next book. Are there any hints as to its content?
Well, there's The Swan, which comes out in October, which I'm editing at the moment. It's sort of done. And The Swan isn't really a bird, of course, is it? It's like Judi Dench or David Attenborough or the Queen. It is simply a national institution. It genuinely isn't a bird. People don't think of swans as birds. They think of them as a sort of thing in our lives, don't they? You know, it's there. It's like sort of David Attenborough with malice, isn't it? A swan, because people love swans and they're really scared of them at the same time.
Well, you know, you did that thing last year where you made a very simple comment on radio about how birds of prey were abundant, and then that got used against you because they cut out the but. I feel that you've just made one of those wonderful comments and going, swans aren't really birds, are they? And it's like, well, we can use that in isolation. And
absolutely, yeah. I'm sure whatever that organisation is that's named after a Star Wars character will use that, yeah. But they're probably not listening, hopefully.
It'd be a shame. I'd enjoy it if they were.
So actually, no, the next book, I can tell you what it is. I'm doing a book for Faber, which you know all about, Lucy, because you're researching it, called 10 Birds That Changed the World. And I'm not going to tell you very much more apart from the fact it is brilliantly researched. So it's by Lucy, not me, because I hate research. I like the writing bit. So yeah, that will come out in about 2.5 years' time, I think.
And I can clarify that Stephen is a marvellous boss to work for. Very professional, all the way. Not as much swearing as there is.
I am paying her, can I just say? Not for that comment, but for the research. not enough, I feel, but
I'll settle for anything. It's fine, don't worry. Donald Murray, incidentally, has chipped in on this, saying he'll settle for a sixth of your advance.
Yeah, fair deal, Donald. Yeah.
So, question from Fiona Pitcher. Given the political flavour of your latest book, what might you hope to be saying a year from now about the climate emergency and about our wildlife?
Well, funnily enough, Fiona is a dear friend of mine and my former boss. The 10 Birds That Changed the World is about 10 birds that changed the world. But what it's really about is when we mess with nature, it will bite us back. That's the fundamental purpose of this book. And the last chapter, the bird is Emperor Penguin. I'm not going to tell you the other 9, but the bird is Emperor Penguin. And of course, the subject is the climate emergency. So Lucy will be spending a lot of time over the next year looking into that. And then I'll read it through and say, well, that's really interesting. Lucy's turning up the most extraordinary stories in this, and it's one of those books that it's potentially infinite. But
oh, it is. When you get sucked into politics, oh my goodness, I'm sitting there thinking, what's the bird that I'm meant to be talking about? Because I'm sucked into some deep historical politics right now, and I can't remember what we were talking about.
That's right. There's a lot of history and politics in that book, but we'll see. It's quite interesting finding the balance, but we'll see. But that's because I wanted to write a global book. I actually felt I've written enough. I've written a lot about where I live, and I've written a lot about British birds, and I wanted actually to broaden it because so much nature writing can be, sometimes I think unfairly, accused of being parochial, of being, British nature writing tends to be about British subjects, which is fine, because that's what we know about and care about. But there is a big wide world out there. And so I felt the need, I suppose, to do something a bit different.
Brilliant. Question from Simon. Have you had any memorable nature watching disasters with Rosie?
I don't know that I should tell you this. I didn't put it in the book, but yes.
Did it happen last year?
It happened during the spring. Oh, she's back. Come here, gorgeous.
I don't know if you're like me, but personally, I'm someone in a room who will gravitate towards the animal rather than the humans. So
Yes.
I think a number of people on this are probably like high-fiving the dog at the moment,
Of course they
because
are.
we'd all be listening to you if we were sitting in a room with you, but we'd all be hoping the dog came over.
Well, people posted lovely photos the other day when I did one of her of their dog reading the book, which is great. I feel we have a meme going on here. I can't say what she did, but it was pretty grisly, and it wasn't good, and I didn't put it in the book. It was the only thing I left out. I felt so upset. She does eat baby rabbits on our lawn occasionally. Okay. Usually ones she hasn't caught, usually ones that she finds them, but sometimes she catches them. But she's slowing down, so yeah, she hasn't caught the rats.
They're in the book as well.
They're in the book as well, yeah.
The neophobic rats.
The neophobic rats.
Don't worry, I know a Jack Russell that can take out a muntjac deer. Can't get much more grisly than that. At least that was an invasive species, though. So just to clarify, Dick Philby has volunteered to guide you to see emperor penguins. Which
well, funny enough, Dick, I have seen an emperor penguin, because I went to Antarctica once, and there was a vagrant emperor penguin in the sort of Antarctic equivalent of Spain. It was like something like 1,000 miles north of where it should have been. But thank you, Dick. You say volunteer. I hope that doesn't involve any kind of expense on my part.
Of course not. And I'll be coming too as your researcher.
Oh, your husband asked a question.
He has, but no, you're skipping ahead. Question from Emma Russell. Why are there so many swans on the levels? They're everywhere. I wanted to almost add a swear word in there, because you can just feel like, where have all these swans come from, Stephen?
They are. And there are groups that a friend of mine here described as Club 1830 for swans. In the summer, you get the teenage swans, the ones that aren't breeding yet, so they're 1 or 2 years old. So they breed when they're 3 or 4. And they just loaf about on the levels, and they do look like a sort of bunch of, kids, teenage kids. It's just a very good place for swans. It is genuinely one of the, it has, I think, apart from Abbotsbury, which of course is an artificial reason, the swannery there where they feed them, I think it has the highest density of mute swans anywhere in Britain. It's certainly one of the highest. Norfolk Broads is probably up there as well. And I think it's just the habitat and the food, it's like it is with most birds. It comes down to that. But yeah, there are an awful lot of swans here.
Brilliant. So I'm going to ignore that one for a minute. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Ken Davis said, Ari the new naturalist. Stephen once said that the highlight of his wedding day was receiving a signed perfect copy of the Hawfinch. Does Suzanne know that? Because I know that she's watching.
It wasn't the highlight of my wedding day. It was a highlight of my wedding day. I would say it was probably in the bronze medal position. I won't go into the other two. But what happened was that, and this tells you a lot about Suzanne, that you know anyway, and some other people will know. We went to Canterbury about 3 months before we got married, where Suzanne was doing her MA. And we went into a bookshop and I saw a pristine copy of The Hawfinch by Guy Mountfort, which I hadn't got. And it was something like £250. And I looked at it and I thought, I really want that. And I can't justify it. We can't really afford that. We're getting married, we're paying for the wedding and whatever. So I came home and the next day I said, oh God, I really wish I'd got that book. And she said, why don't you ring them up on Monday? Why don't you ring them up and ask? So I rang them up and they said, oh, really sorry, we sold it. And I was like, oh, it's so unlucky. Of course, she'd bought it. She'd sneaked back into the place, that day, bought it and presented it to me on our wedding day, which was very sweet of her because she knew it, it was something that was personal. I never actually met Guy Mountfort. I'd love to have done. There's so many of those great birders of the past that I didn't meet, and Guy Mountfort would have been very high on the list. But so it was lovely having the book. But it wasn't the highlight of my wedding day, Suzanne.
That is a very lovely story, though, and that if anyone she is genuinely, I think, the mother to us all. She kind of adopts so many of us and mothers us and makes sure that we're all fed and watered and happy and comfy so constantly. She is the most marvelous of people.
Yes, so, and it's her birthday on Monday. Happy birthday, Suzanne. Big birthday on Monday. Let's not go there.
Everybody say happy birthday to Suzanne in the chat, please. So my terribly impertinent husband has asked a question, which is brilliant because I thought he was downstairs looking after the child. Will there come a time when bookshelves are saturated with mossy books and you have naught more to say?
Well, what I like is that Nigel, the lovely Nigel, has asked a question back. Rob Lambert, when's your book coming out? I did once say to Rob, he told me once that he read my books on the plane to Australia. And I said, blimey, Rob, they don't take that long to write, which isn't quite true. But while I've still got things I want to write about, then I'll keep writing. As I say, the Skylarks with Rosie came out of the blue. And I suppose it's my most honest book because I hadn't planned it out. I didn't edit it in the sense of trying to gloss over things or change things, apart from the incident with Rosie, which we won't go into. So yeah, I'll carry on writing. And I would, all the writers here watching this and all the students that I work with, I say teach, we don't really teach our students, we work with them and they work with each other, and it's the most wonderful experience. We all know that you cannot help writing. It's like breathing, it's like birding. You can't, if you're into it. So if I won the lottery tomorrow, would I carry on writing? Yes, of course. I don't know what, but in 10 years' time, I'll revisit all the old ones. I have to revisit my history of birdwatching because I wrote that 15 years ago, and the last bit mentions a new thing called, as Rob would call it, Tinternet. And I say something along the lines of, this internet malarkey, it's bound to have quite an effect on nature conservation and birding in the future.
Oh, that's marvellous.
Yeah, I think I was right, but now I need to revise the book and add that in.
15 years later, here you are launching your book on Tinternet.
On Tinternet, yeah, exactly.
Where would we be without Tinternet now? But that is marvellous. So that is all of the there are, from what I can gather, have been literally hundreds of jokes and comments, and now birthday greetings to Suzanne. But unless any more questions come in the next 10 seconds or so, Stephen, I'm going to pass back to you for your final reading. And I'm not entirely sure which bit you're going to choose, whether you're going to choose the summer solstice or the winter solstice.
I'm going to choose the summer solstice because I think it's important that we look forward. And I think it's more related to the book. So thank you. Here we go. It's quite short. When my children were younger, we would spend Father's Day looking for butterflies, specifically rare butterflies that I'd not yet managed to see. Back in 2007, we tramped up Collard Hill on the scarp slope of the Poldens near Glastonbury to search for and find the large blue. 2 years later, on a breezy June day, we hiked across Exmoor, where, in a steep-sided coombe, we eventually found the Heath Fritillary. Today, the day after the summer solstice, we're on a more leisurely family walk around the loop with Rosie. There's a neat symmetry to our excursion, for here is where this book began, just 3 months ago. As ever, Rosie runs a few yards ahead of us, sniffs the grassy verge, then turns around to make sure we're still there. The fields are bleached a straw colour now, a far cry from the verdant green at the start of lockdown. The soundtrack is very different too. Just a few birds are still singing, including twittering goldfinches and newly fledged swallows, and a single whitethroat. But now the bleating of sheep predominates as lambs and ewes call constantly to one another. The wind, too, is high in the mix as it rushes through the reeds, some of which has grown so tall they almost block the view. Spring is finally over. The nights are beginning to draw in, and the world has changed. It's not that nature disappears for the remaining half of the year, but it is harder to find, and the visual and oral onrush that marked the first few weeks of lockdown is now over, until next spring at least. I'll carry on walking around the loop with Rosie and look forward to the subtler delights of late summer, autumn, and then winter, as the seasons merge gradually into one another like water rolling down a hill. And then, just as the wind drops for a moment, we hear it. A brief snatch of the song of a skylark somewhere in the sky above. Skylarks with Rosie. Once again.
Stephen, that was so beautiful. Thank you. Just to recap, this is the beautiful book available in all independent booksellers and online in all your usual retailers as well. And of course, you can get signed copies. For me, this book was just comforting more than anything. It felt cozy. It felt familiar, even though it wasn't familiar to me. I know where you live, but I've never walked those routes before. But I think anyone reading it will just have this sense of recognition, not necessarily of the exact species you're talking about, but of that rhythm of a local patch, and most of all of last year, which was so fraught for so many people, but in which we took comfort and solace in the littlest of things. And for me, it was the return of the House Martins and the Swifts. And everyone will have those moments from last year that anchored them to reality when it seemed like we were living in a virtual reality that just it couldn't possibly, this couldn't be happening, it couldn't be real. So to me, this is like drinking a very nice cup of tea or a very nice glass of red wine or eating a whole bar of chocolate in one. It's utterly beautifully written and it's comforting and cozy, and you just want to put yourself in a big blanket, go outside in an evening and listen to this, and read this, right, which is exactly what I recommend that you do. The marvelous thing about doing events like this, which is the big difference, is that what we see coming through are names who we recognize, who we haven't seen for months, years, and we see those names pop up, and it's so lovely to know that we're sharing this moment with you right now. But at the same time, we see new people who neither of us have ever met before, who wouldn't have otherwise got to go to Stephen's book launch, but they're here and they're celebrating. And there's all these marvelous ways of making new friends, and like Stephen said, feeling part of this nature family. So Stephen, is there anything else you want to add? Any message for your audience other than buy my book? Anything else you want to say to them?
Only to say, just to thank a few people, obviously Carrie Ackroyd, who does, the most beautiful covers. And over on the room over there, I have her original, which I got from her, which is just, again, anchors me in this place. Obviously to Sarah Band, her own firm that she started, just a wonderful publisher, really punches above its weight. Thanks to Nick at Mr. B for selling the books, and all the local bookshops, Brendan Books, my own local shop in Taunton, and all the others. Please, if you can buy this book from an indie bookshop, do. They're either open soon or they're doing mail order. And of course, thanks to my family, but mainly thanks to you, Lucy, because, that's lovely. I felt slightly embarrassed by some of the nice things you said tonight, which is always good. And
you're done for the year. I'll be horrible.
Yeah, no, I know that. Yeah, she's horrible to me otherwise. But it's been such a pleasure. And what you just said was lovely. The fact that, and lockdown was like this as well, old friends and new friends. And that's what it's all about. So I think what we've learned from last year was appreciate everything more. Appreciate your friends, your family, lockdown, other people. I'll promise I'll try to be less angry on Twitter and more positive. And, just thanks for everyone for coming tonight. And it's been an absolute delight for me. So I hope you've enjoyed it. I
think we all like the new evolution of Angry Stephen, because it's very well timed and you're usually saying what we're all thinking. So don't tone it back too much. Thank you all for joining us tonight. It's been marvellous to have you here. Stephen and I can now have a glass of wine, which we couldn't do before. I really hope that you have all been having a glass of wine or equivalent whilst you've been watching. Have a marvellous rest of your evening. We're nearly there, folks. We're getting there, and we're getting towards spring as well. So we'll speak to you all very soon, and thank you very much to Sarah as well. You can hand her over if you want. We're pretty much done. Who's that?
Hi, Georgie.